Charlie Chaplin was not merely a man who made films. He was a man who changed what film could be. Born on April 16, 1889, in London, England, Chaplin rose from poverty, abandonment, and hunger to become the most recognizable face on earth. His little tramp bowler hat, cane, and mustache became a symbol of resilience, of humanity itself. He didn't just make audiences laugh. He made them cry, and in doing so, he taught cinema to speak without words. But behind the artist who built an empire from silence stood a man whose private life was as dramatic as his work. Chaplin was both adored and condemned, celebrated and exiled. He fell in love with youth beauty and idealism, and often with the women who embodied them. His romantic life was controversial, filled with scandal and obsession. But from those storms came the great anchor of his final years' family. In 1943, at the age of 54, Chaplin married Una O'Neill, the daughter of playwright Eugene O'Neill. She was just 18, and the world was quick to judge. Yet against all odds, their marriage endured for more than 3 decades, producing 11 children each. A piece of the man who once said that life is a tragedy, when seen close up, but a comedy in long shot. Together they created something Chaplin never had as a boy: stability, warmth, and unconditional love. Those 11 children were born into the shadow of a legend, yet grew into individuals who carried fragments of his genius into every generation. Some became artists, others philosophers. Some disappeared from public life altogether, but all of them lived with the inescapable truth of being a Chaplin. This is not the story of the Tramp or of Hollywood's silent age. It is the story of the man who gave laughter to the world, and of the 11 voices that carry that laughter forward. Number 11, Geraldine Chaplin. Geraldine Lee Chaplin was born on July 31, 1944 in Santa Monica, California, the first child of Charlie Chaplin and Una O'Neill. She arrived at the height of her father's exile from the United States, an era when the man who had made America laugh was now being chased by its politics. For Charlie, Geraldine's birth was a rebirth of his own hope. He poured into her the love and devotion he had been denied as a child, determined to give her what fame and poverty had once stolen from him: security. Geraldine grew up in Switzerland, in the family's sprawling estate at Coursier-sur-Vevey. There she witnessed her father in his twilight years, no longer the tramp, but a patriarch, surrounded by music, creativity, and laughter. Her mother, Una, was the center of gravity, shielding the children from the turbulence of politics and press. Yet Geraldine inherited her father's fire. She was restless, curious, and drawn to performance, though her father discouraged her from following his path, fearing the cruelty of show business. But destiny has a way of reclaiming its own. In the 1960s, Geraldine stepped into the spotlight, earning acclaim in Dr. Zhivago 1965 as Tanya, a role that introduced her to international audiences. She would go on to work with cinematic masters like Carlos Saura, Robert Altman, and David Lean, carving a career of emotional precision and artistic daring. Her performances, often steeped in introspection, carried the unmistakable DNA of her father's pathos, the same delicate balance between comedy and heartbreak that defined his work. Unlike her father, Geraldine never sought to dominate the world. She sought to understand it. Fluent in multiple languages, she built a transcontinental career, moving between Europe and the Americas, her name respected but never exploited. She often spoke of her father not as an untouchable icon, but as a man who loved deeply, worked obsessively, and forgave quietly. Now in her late 70s, Geraldine remains one of the most enduring symbols of the Chaplin lineage. An actress whose grace and intelligence mirror the man who created the Tramp, but whose identity stands entirely on its own. Through her, Charlie Chaplin's spirit found continuity, not in imitation, but in evolution, the art of feeling without words, reborn in a new century. Number 10. Michael Chaplin. Michael John Chaplin was born on March 7, 1946, in Santa Monica, California, the second child of Charlie Chaplin and Una O'Neill. He arrived during one of the most turbulent chapters of his father's life, when Chaplin, hounded by accusations of communism and moral scandal, was forced to leave America. The family settled in Switzerland, where Charlie would live out his remaining years in exile. For Michael, that meant growing up surrounded by the paradox of peace and legend, sheltered from the world, yet haunted by his father's global shadow. Charlie Chaplin was 60 when Michael was born, already a figure of myth, yet still deeply human at home. He was affectionate but demanding, tender, but exacting, a man who expected discipline from everyone, especially his children. Michael later described his childhood as both idyllic and confining, endless games in the gardens of Coursier-sur-Vevey, but also an awareness that everything in their lives revolved around one man, the great Charlie Chaplin. As a teenager, Michael rebelled against that gravitational pull. He pursued acting despite his father's warnings about the cost of fame. His first major appearance came in The Sandwich Man, 1966, followed by The Deadly Affair and The Hawaiians. But fame brought him little satisfaction. He drifted toward a life of restlessness, torn between wanting to live up to his father's name and wanting to escape it entirely. In 1960, his relationship with Charlie strained when Michael published a memoir titled, "I Couldn't Smoke the Grass on My Father's Lawn," an account of growing up Chaplin that mixed honesty with resentment. The book caused a quiet rift within the family, and for years Michael lived apart, wandering between London, Spain, and the south of France. Over time, however, he found reconciliation not just with his father's memory, but with the legacy he had once resisted. Michael later married and became the father of several children, including Carmen Chaplin and Una Chaplin, both of whom would follow the family tradition into acting. His daughter Una, named after her grandmother, gained international recognition for her roles in Game of Thrones and The Longest Ride, ensuring that the Chaplin name continues to flicker on modern screens. Today, Michael lives quietly in Europe, a man who has carried both the burden and the brilliance of his lineage. He is the son who tested the myth and survived it, who learned that being Charlie Chaplin's child meant forever walking between reverence and rebellion. Number 9. Josephine Chaplin. Josephine. Hannah Chaplin was born on March 28, 1949, in Santa Monica, California, the third child of Charlie Chaplin and Una O'Neill. She was born into exile, the daughter of a man who had once ruled Hollywood, but was now banished from it. By the time she was old enough to speak, her father's laughter had grown softer, his fame more distant. For Josephine, childhood was defined by contrasts, the comfort of Swiss mountains against the memory of a father's lost empire, the warmth of family against the weight of history. Growing up at Manoir de Ban, the Chaplin family home in Coursier-sur-Vevey, Josephine was surrounded by art and imagination. Charlie was a devoted but aging father, still writing scripts, still conducting orchestras of memory from his piano. Una kept the household alive with grace and calm. Among the younger siblings, Josephine was known for her sensitivity and poise. She was quiet, introspective, yet unmistakably her father's daughter, sharp-minded, creative, and unafraid of irony. At 18, she stepped into acting, debuting in her father's final film, A Countess from Hong Kong, 1967, alongside Marlon Brando and Sophia Loren. Though the film received lukewarm reviews, it marked Josephine's entrance into cinema, a torch passed quietly from father to daughter. She continued acting through the 1970s and 1980s, appearing in European productions such as Escape to the Sun and The Canterbury Tales, earning praise for her understated elegance and emotional depth. Yet, fame never seduced her. Josephine often said that she preferred the art of storytelling to the politics of stardom. While her siblings sought their own callings in acting or family, she focused on maintaining her father's cinematic heritage. After Charlie's death in 1977, Josephine played an active role in preserving his legacy, overseeing film restorations and representing the Chaplin estate at international events. Her personal life was defined by independence and quiet strength. She married the French archaeologist Jean-Claude Gardin and later dedicated herself to family life in Paris and Switzerland. In her final years, she continued to support artistic and humanitarian causes, reflecting the same gentleness that once guided her father's humor. Josephine Chaplin passed away in July 2023 at the age of 74. Her death marked the loss of one of the last direct voices of Charlie Chaplin's golden household. She left behind not only her own artistic work, but the living memory of a daughter who grew up inside one of the 20th century's most extraordinary stories, and who carried it forward with dignity, humility, and grace. Number 8. Victoria Chaplin. Victoria Chaplin was born on May 19, 1951, in Santa Monica, California, the fourth child of Charlie Chaplin and Una O'Neill. By the time she entered the world, her father was 62, an aging genius whose legacy was already immortal, yet who found new life through his young family. For Victoria, childhood was an unusual mixture of normality and myth. She was one of 11 children in a household that functioned like its own world, tucked away in the Swiss countryside, ruled by a man who had once ruled the silent screen. Of all Chaplin's children, Victoria inherited the purest strand of his creative daring. She was playful, imaginative, and fascinated by the idea of transforming the ordinary into the magical, a gift that would later define her entire life. In her youth, she expressed interest in film and theater, but she quickly realized that her heart lay not in acting, but in live performance. In the late 1960s, she met French actor and circus performer Jean-Baptiste Thierry, a meeting that would change the course of her life. The two shared a vision to reinvent the circus, to strip it of its cliches, and restore it as a space of poetry, mystery, and humanity. In 1970, they eloped against her parents' wishes and soon after founded Le Cirque Bonjour, followed by Le Cirque Imaginaire, and later Le Cirque Invisible. Their blend of theater acrobatics and pantomime created a new art form that critics called Chaplinesque in its tenderness and whimsy. Victoria became its silent muse, transforming movement into story illusion, into feeling. Charlie Chaplin, though initially resistant to her unconventional path, would later recognize in her the spirit that had animated his own art, the ability to communicate everything without saying a word. Through her partnership with Thierry, Victoria carried the DNA of silent cinema into the language of modern performance. She and Jean-Baptiste had 2 children, James and Aurélia Thierry, both of whom inherited the family's theatrical genius and went on to become celebrated performers in their own right. Through them, the Chaplin lineage of movement and emotion gesture, as poetry, humor, as empathy, continues to thrive on stage around the world. Today, Victoria lives in France, still quietly devoted to the world she and her husband built from imagination. She remains the child who turned her father's legacy inside out, not by repeating his art, but by translating it into something new, something alive. In her, Charlie Chaplin's vision of universal communication through laughter, grace, and movement found a modern echo that refuses to fade. Number 7. Eugene Chaplin. Eugene Anthony Chaplin was born on August 23, 1953, in Vevey, Switzerland, the 5th child of Charlie Chaplin and Una O'Neill. By the time Eugene was old enough to understand who his father was, Charlie had already become a figure of legend. But within the walls of the family home, Manoir de Ban, the legend faded into a gentle, often humorous man who loved to tell stories, compose melodies on the piano, and laugh with his children until tears filled his eyes. For Eugene, that version of his father, the human one, would remain the most precious truth. Eugene grew up in an environment where creativity was as natural as breathing. The house was alive with music sketches and ideas. Charlie would often encourage his children to think differently, to question everything. Eugene absorbed this spirit fully. He became fascinated, not just with performance, but with the mechanics behind it, the technology, the rhythm, and the sound. While his siblings pursued acting and art, Eugene took a path behind the curtain, one that would allow him to shape emotion through engineering. In the 1970s, he trained as an audio engineer and eventually worked with some of the most iconic musicians of the era, including the Rolling Stones and Queen. His meticulous ear and calm temperament made him a sought-after recording engineer. Later, he shifted toward documentary production, directing Charlie Chaplin, The Forgotten Years, a heartfelt exploration of his father's life in Switzerland, the years the world rarely saw. It was his way of reclaiming that chapter of history, showing Charlie not as a myth, but as a father who cooked meals, played violin, and sought peace after a life of turmoil. Eugene also served as the president of the International Comedy Film Festival in Vevey. Promoting the kind of artistry, his father had pioneered humor as a language of empathy. His projects, always thoughtful and understated, reflect a deep understanding of emotion, rhythm, and craft, the same elements that made Chaplin's films immortal. In interviews, Eugene often speaks with affection and quiet pride about his family, describing his father as a man who believed that laughter was the closest thing to heaven. Like many of his siblings, he inherited not fame but perspective, a recognition that the truest tribute to greatness is not imitation, but authenticity. Now, living in Switzerland, Eugene continues to curate his father's legacy, bridging generation and sunrise through festivals, films, and sound. He represents the pragmatic side of the Chaplin family, the engineer of memory, the craftsman of laughter. Through him, the great silent voice of cinema continues to resonate, one perfectly tuned note at a time. Number 6. Jane Chaplin, Jane Cecil. Chaplin was born on May 23, 1957, in Vevey, Switzerland, the sixth child of Charlie Chaplin and Una O'Neill. By the time she arrived, her father was 68 years old, a man of mythic stature, living in quiet exile, surrounded by the noise of his own legacy and the laughter of his growing brood. For Jane, childhood was both enchanted and heavy enchanted, because she lived in a household filled with imagination, and heavy because she was forever tethered to a name the world refused to forget. Jane grew up watching her father work late into the night, still writing, still sketching ideas for films that might never be made. She saw Una's serene devotion hold the family together, her mother's grace acting as the calm against Charlie's intensity. Their home in Coursier-sur-Vevey was a kind of kingdom, part museum, part sanctuary, where greatness was both present and invisible. As a teenager, Jane began to test the boundaries of that serene world. While some of her siblings followed artistic callings, Jane felt the pull of independence. In her early 20s, she moved to the United States, drawn to Hollywood more by curiosity than ambition. But there she learned what her father had always feared, that fame could both illuminate and consume. Though she appeared briefly in small acting projects, she soon realized that the world had little space for another Chaplin on screen. Instead, Jane focused her creative energy elsewhere, writing, traveling, and exploring spirituality. She married Argentine filmmaker Patricio Castilla, with whom she had twin daughters. Though their marriage ended, the partnership allowed her to understand storytelling from a new lens, not as performance, but as introspection. In interviews, Jane has spoken candidly about the complexity of being Charlie Chaplin's daughter. She admired his genius, but acknowledged the emotional distance that came with it. He loved deeply, she once said, but he lived in a world that existed only in his mind. We were all trying to find our place in it. Her words reveal not resentment, but recognition, a deep understanding of a father whose brilliance could never fully belong to one family. Jane has lived much of her adult life away from publicity, splitting her time between Europe and South America. Like many of her siblings, she chose privacy over spectacle, introspection over inheritance. Yet, in her quiet rebellion, she carries forward one of her father's most enduring lessons: that meaning is not found in applause, but in authenticity. If Geraldine, Michael, and Josephine carried his artistry, Jane carries his introspection, the part of Charlie Chaplin that stood still while the world laughed. Number 5. Annette Chaplin. Annette Emily Chaplin was born on December 3, 1959, in Vevey, Switzerland, the seventh child of Charlie Chaplin and Una O'Neill. By the time she arrived, her father was 70. His once frantic pace slowed, but his creative mind still restless. Annette grew up in the hushed afterglow of a legend's life. A childhood surrounded by the laughter of siblings, the grace of her mother, and the lingering genius of a father who now lived more in memory than in fame. Unlike her older siblings who carried vivid recollections of Charlie's working years, Annette knew him mostly as a presence of warmth and music. He would sit by the piano composing melodies from the air, sometimes inviting the children to dance while he played. To her, he was not the tramp, not the filmmaker worshipped by millions, but Papa, a man whose humor came not from performance, but from kindness. His love for simplicity would shape Annette's own view of life. As she matured, Annette discovered a natural connection to the arts, not as ambition, but as inheritance. She studied acting and theater, eventually joining stage productions across Europe, including work with her sister Geraldine in France and Spain. On stage, she carried the quiet precision and emotional restraint that defined her father's performances, but in her own way, soft-spoken, reflective, and unhurried. She never chased stardom, preferring the intimacy of live performance, where storytelling feels more like communion than entertainment. In the 1980s and 1990s, Annette appeared in a handful of films and television productions, though she remained primarily devoted to theater. Her artistic philosophy was simple: to make people feel without forcing emotion, an echo of Charlie Chaplin's own mastery. Off stage, she has lived a private life, splitting her time between Switzerland and France, close to her family, and involved in cultural initiatives, celebrating her father's cinematic contributions. Friends and collaborators describe Annette as gentle, yet firm, someone who carries an almost spiritual calm. While others protect the Chaplin legacy through archives, foundations, and media, Annette protects it through presence, the living embodiment of its quieter side. She represents the stillness that lay beneath her father's chaos, the humility behind his humor. If her siblings extend Chaplin's influence outward, Annette turns it inward, preserving not the myth, but the humanity. She is the daughter who reminds us that Charlie Chaplin's greatest creation was not the tramp, but the family that learned to find beauty in ordinary life. Number 4. Christopher Chaplin. Christopher James. Chaplin was born on July 6, 1962, in Corsier-sur-Vevey, Switzerland, the 8th child of Charlie Chaplin and Una O'Neill. By the time Christopher came into the world, his father was 73, a living monument of cinema's past, and his mother, barely 36, was raising a household that was both vibrant and deeply private. For Christopher, childhood meant growing up inside the echo of greatness. The name Chaplin was everywhere, but the man himself was frail, reflective, a quiet figure surrounded by affection and myth. Christopher was only 15 when Charlie died in 1977, yet those years left an imprint. He remembered his father not through the eyes of the world, but through small, intimate gestures. A hand on the shoulder, a story before bed, the slow rhythm of piano keys in the evening. To Christopher, Charlie Chaplin was not just the creator of the Tramp, but the patient father who still smiled despite age and exile. As a teenager, Christopher gravitated toward the arts, but rejected the easy inheritance of cinema. While some of his siblings embraced acting, Christopher turned to sound philosophy and experimentation. He studied classical piano and composition, drawn to the language of music as a form of abstraction, the one art form his father loved as deeply as film. Over time, that passion transformed into a career that was entirely his own. In adulthood, Christopher became a composer and musician, known for his avant-garde and ambient works that combine orchestral depth with electronic soundscapes. His albums, such as Je suis le ténébreux and Paradise Lost, reflect an artist searching not for fame, but for meaning. Critics often note that his music carries the melancholic precision that once defined his father's silent films, a dialogue between emotion and silence. Though reclusive, Christopher has participated in select artistic projects, honoring his father, contributing music to Chaplin-themed exhibitions and retrospectives. His work stands as an extension of the Chaplin spirit, expressive, yet restrained, emotional, yet disciplined. He once described his father's legacy as a long shadow, but not a heavy one. That sentiment defines him. Christopher is the philosopher of the family, the contemplative son who turned his inheritance into inquiry, transforming the language of cinema into the language of sound. If Geraldine represents Chaplin's art and Eugene his craftsmanship, Christopher represents his introspection, the still searching heart beneath all the laughter. Through him, the spirit of Charlie Chaplin continues not in film reels, but in resonance, the quiet vibration of a genius reborn through music. Number 3. Joseph Chaplin. Joseph Daniel Chaplin was born on March 16, 1964, in Corsier-sur-Vevey, Switzerland, the 9th child of Charlie Chaplin and Una O'Neill. By the time Joseph arrived, the Chaplin household had become less a home and more a universe. 11 children, each orbiting the gravitational pull of a father whose name still carried the weight of cinematic immortality. Charlie was 75, no longer the restless performer of his youth, but a tender, observant man, surrounded by laughter, chaos, and the quiet satisfaction of having built the family he never had as a child. Joseph grew up in the long afternoon of his father's life, when the house at Manoir de Bon had settled into a gentle rhythm of art study and play. The garden became the stage, the dining room, the theater. There was no need for fiction. Every day was its own story. He absorbed the habits of creativity from both parents. Una's elegance and calm, Charlie's humor and discipline. To Joseph, the Chaplin legacy was never a burden. It was simply the atmosphere he breathed. Unlike many of his older siblings, Joseph was too young to remember his father's years of artistic struggle or political controversy. He knew only the serene figure of an old man with white hair and eyes full of mischief. After Charlie's passing in 1977, Joseph spent much of his youth surrounded by the echoes of that myth, learning to define himself beyond it. He pursued education quietly, studying literature, art, and communication, though the specifics of his path have largely remained private. While some of his siblings carried the Chaplin name into public life, Joseph chose discretion. He has made rare appearances at retrospectives and family events, speaking about his father's human side, rather than his fame about the man who read stories aloud at bedtime and laughed hardest at his own jokes. Those who have met Joseph describe him as kind, soft-spoken, and contemplative. He lives primarily in Switzerland, close to the family estate, participating occasionally in projects that honor his father's humanitarian and artistic contributions. For him, the Chaplin name is not a torch to wield, but a light to protect, a reminder of the humility behind the legend. If his siblings embody the different shades of Charlie's artistry, Joseph represents its peace. He carries forward the quiet fulfillment his father found only in his final years, a life no longer defined by applause, but by the laughter of children echoing through a home built from love. Number 2. Charles Chaplin Jr. Charles Spencer Chaplin Jr. was born on May 5, 1925, in Beverly Hills, California, the son of Charlie Chaplin and his second wife, actress Leda Gray. He was Charlie's firstborn, a child of controversy, born into a scandal that nearly destroyed his father's career. The marriage between Chaplin and Leda had begun when she was just 16, a fact that ignited a public firestorm in 1924 and forced the comic genius into the harsh glare of moral outrage. Their union was brief, bitter, and doomed. When it collapsed in 1927, it left behind 2 sons, Charles Jr. and Sydney, who would spend their lives navigating the turbulent inheritance of their father's fame. Growing up, Charles Jr. experienced little of the stability that later defined his father's home in Switzerland. His childhood was marked by divorce hearings, tabloid headlines, and a constant tug-of-war between 2 parents consumed by resentment. He saw his father sporadically, often through the prism of a world that alternated between idolizing and vilifying him. Yet despite the chaos, the bond between father and son endured in fragments. Charlie, the perfectionist artist, trying awkwardly to show affection. Charles Jr., the sensitive boy trying to understand the man behind the myth. As a young adult, Charles Jr. followed the magnetic pull of Hollywood. He studied acting and served in the U.S. Army during World War II, returning home with both courage and restlessness. His most notable roles came in films such as The Beat Generation, 1959, and Fangs of the Wild, 1954, where his performances carried a quiet sincerity that hinted at untapped depth. Yet the industry was unkind to him. His last name both opened doors and cast shadows. Being Charlie Chaplin's son meant he could never simply be himself. He struggled with addiction and identity, moving between promise and despair. Despite his personal battles, he never spoke ill of his father. In fact, his 1960 memoir, My Father, Charlie Chaplin, revealed both admiration and pain. A portrait of a man who loved deeply but could not always express it. The book remains one of the most haunting accounts of life under the weight of genius. Charles Chaplin Jr. died young on March 20th, 1968, at the age of 42 from complications related to alcoholism. His death broke his father's heart. Charlie, who had spent his later years building peace and permanence, mourned the son who never found either. In Charles Jr., we see the cost of greatness, the toll that public life can take on private love. He was the first to inherit the Chaplin name, and perhaps the one who bore it most painfully. His life, though brief, served as a warning and a reflection that behind every legend lies a lineage struggling to balance brilliance and belonging. Number 1. Sydney Chaplin, Sydney Earl. Chaplin was born on March 30th, 1926, in Beverly Hills, California, the second son of Charlie Chaplin and actress Lida Gray. He was named after Charlie's beloved half-brother, Sydney Chaplin, the man who had once helped Charlie escape poverty and build his empire. From birth, young Sydney carried the double weight of inheritance, not only the Chaplin name, but also the memory of the brother his father revered most. Sydney's earliest years unfolded amid chaos. His parents' marriage, strained by scandal and resentment, collapsed before he was 2. While Charlie's fame continued to dominate the world, his relationship with Lida Gray dissolved in one of Hollywood's most publicized divorces. For Sydney and his older brother Charles Jr., childhood meant growing up in the glare of other people's judgment, their family drama splashed across front pages. The public saw the Chaplin genius. The children felt its cost. As he grew older, Sydney discovered within himself the same magnetism that had defined his father. He studied acting, trained at the London Academy of Music and Dramatic Art, and briefly worked as a pilot during World War II before returning to the stage. Unlike his older brother, Sydney managed to carve a path through the same industry that had both made and haunted their father. His talent was undeniable, natural, charismatic, with a dry wit that echoed Charlie's, yet grounded in a modern sensibility. In the 1950s, Sydney became one of Broadway's most admired performers. He won the 1957 Tony Award for Best Featured Actor in a Musical for Bells Are Ringing, performing opposite Judy Holliday. On screen, he appeared in films such as Limelight 1952, directed by his father, where he played the role of Neville, a kind-hearted young composer, an uncanny parallel to the hopeful son Charlie wished he could protect. Later, he starred in The Landlord 1970 and A Countess from Hong Kong 1967, reuniting with his father one final time on film. Though his career flourished, Sydney lived with the same contradictions that haunted all of Charlie's children: the search for personal identity amid inherited greatness. He spoke of his father with reverence, but also realism, describing him as a man made of opposites, tender and fierce, generous and unreachable. Their relationship mellowed with time. Distance transformed into understanding. Sydney's later years were marked by a quiet dignity. He withdrew from the spotlight, living in California and occasionally participating in retrospectives honoring his father's legacy. He passed away in March 2009 at the age of 82, leaving behind a body of work that stands as the most successful artistic continuation of Charlie Chaplin's creative DNA. If Charles Jr. carried his father's tragedy, Sydney carried his triumph. He proved that the Chaplin name could endure not only through myth, but through genuine artistry. In him, the fire of comedy became discipline, the shadow of fame became light, and the legacy of Charlie Chaplin, the man who taught the world to laugh, became an inheritance of endurance. Charlie Chaplin's life began in poverty and ended in legend. Between those two extremes, he built not just a cinematic empire, but a family that became its own living masterpiece. 11 children, each carrying a fragment of his brilliance, his contradictions, and his humanity. Together, they tell a story far richer than fame, the story of a man who created laughter from sorrow and love from chaos. Geraldine became the mirror of his artistry, an actress who carried his emotional precision into modern cinema. Michael turned rebellion into reflection, raising new generations of Chaplins who would continue the craft. Josephine brought grace and intellect, devoting her life to preserving her father's memory. Victoria reimagined his spirit through circus and illusion, building new worlds of wonder. Eugene became the engineer of legacy, capturing laughter through sound and film. Jane the Seeker carried his introspection across continents. Annette embodied his gentleness on the stage, proving that subtlety could be as powerful as spectacle. Christopher turned silence into sound, transforming his father's influence into haunting compositions. Joseph preserved the family's quiet strength, living proof that peace too can be inherited. And from an earlier, more turbulent chapter, came Charles Jr. and Sydney, two sons, who faced the full storm of their father's fame, one succumbing to its pain, the other mastering its art. They are 11 lives shaped by one man's genius, each reflecting a different facet of his soul. From triumph to tragedy, from rebellion to reverence, they form a single unfinished portrait of Charlie Chaplin, the artist who gave the world its first true cinematic language and then passed that gift piece by piece to his children. In the end, Chaplin's greatest creation was not the Tramp, nor his films, nor even the laughter that united millions. It was the life he built after the spotlight dimmed, a home filled with love music and the laughter of children. Those sounds, more than any reel of film, were his final masterpiece. His children carried that melody across decades and continents, each adding their own rhythm until it became a symphony of memory, a reminder that art, when born of compassion, never truly dies. Charlie Chaplin once said, "A day without laughter is a day wasted." Through his 11 children, the world has not wasted a single one.